Child keeps saying he watches me. Teacher sets up camera and sees this. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Willowbrook Elementary as Sarah Mitchell arranged the small wooden chairs in perfect semicircles around her desk. 22 years of teaching had taught her that Mondays required extra patience, but this particular October morning felt different. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar sterile glow across the cheerful bulletin boards decorated with pumpkins and falling leaves. Sarah had always prided herself on reading her students like open books. In her second-grade classroom, she could spot a forgotten lunch, a sleepless night, or trouble at home from across the room. But lately, one of her students had become an enigma that troubled her more with each passing day. Tommy Henderson sat in the third row, second seat from the window. 7 years old with sandy brown hair that perpetually fell across his forehead, he had once been one of her brightest, most eager students. But over the past 3 weeks, something had changed. Something that made Sarah's teacher instincts sound alarm bells she couldn't quite articulate. "Good morning, class," Sarah announced with practiced cheer as her students filed in from the hallway, their rain-dampened jackets creating a symphony of zippers and shuffling feet. "Please hang your coats and take your seats. We have an exciting day ahead of us." The children responded with the usual mixture of enthusiasm and grogginess that characterized Monday mornings. All except Tommy, who moved to his seat with deliberate slowness, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the tall windows that lined the eastern wall of the classroom. Sarah watched him settle into his chair, noting how he positioned himself so he could maintain a clear view of the class while appearing to face forward. "Today we're going to continue our unit on community helpers," Sarah continued, pulling down the projector screen. "Can anyone tell me what we learned about firefighters last week?" Hands shot up around the room, eager voices calling out answers about fire trucks and safety. But Sarah's attention remained partially fixed on Tommy, who had begun that peculiar ritual she'd noticed developing over recent days. He would glance toward the window, then down at his desk, then toward the window again, as if checking to see if something, or someone, was still there. During their mathematics lesson, while the other children worked diligently on addition problems, Tommy abandoned his worksheet entirely. Instead, he picked up a black crayon and began drawing on the margins of his paper. Sarah moved closer, her soft-soled shoes silent on the worn carpet, and peered over his shoulder. The drawing made her breath catch in her throat. It was a window, unmistakably a window, with a dark figure standing just outside. The figure was roughly human-shaped but featureless, a shadow pressed against the glass. Around the drawing, in his careful 7-year-old handwriting, Tommy had written the same phrase 3 times, "He watches me." "Tommy," Sarah said gently, crouching beside his desk so she was at his eye level. "That's an interesting drawing. Can you tell me about it?" The boy's response was barely above a whisper, his eyes never leaving the paper. "He's always there, Mrs. Mitchell. Always watching." "Who is always watching, sweetheart?" Tommy's small shoulders tensed, and he glanced quickly toward the window before looking back at his drawing. "I can't say. He told me not to tell." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. She had heard variations of this phrase before, in training sessions and workshops that all teachers were required to attend. They were words that set off every protective instinct she possessed. "Tommy, you know you can tell me anything, right? Anything at all." But the boy had already begun erasing his drawing, pressing so hard with the pink eraser that he tore through the paper. "I need to go to the bathroom," he mumbled, raising his hand in the universal gesture of childhood urgency. Sarah granted permission, watching as Tommy practically ran from the room. Through her open door, she could see him pause in the hallway, looking back toward the classroom windows from this new angle. He stood there for several long moments, as if trying to see something that might be visible from outside the building. When he returned 10 minutes later, his face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly as he took his seat. Sarah made a mental note to observe more carefully, to document what she was seeing. Something was very wrong, and every instinct she had developed over 2 decades of working with children told her that time might be a critical factor. The morning progressed with reading groups and spelling practice, but Sarah found herself continuously monitoring Tommy's behavior. During independent reading time, while other children sprawled comfortably on the reading carpet with their picture books, Tommy chose a spot directly beside her desk, positioning himself so that his back was to the wall and he could see both the door and the windows simultaneously. "Mrs. Mitchell," he whispered during a quiet moment when the other children were absorbed in their books, "do you think bad things can happen at school?" The question was so unexpected, so loaded with an anxiety that seemed far too mature for a 7-year-old, that Sarah felt her heart rate increase. "What kind of bad things are you worried about, Tommy?" "Just bad things. Things that aren't supposed to happen." Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that how she responded might determine whether Tommy would continue to confide in her. "School is supposed to be a safe place, Tommy. And if something doesn't feel safe, or if someone is making you uncomfortable, it's always okay to tell a grown-up you trust." Tommy nodded solemnly but said nothing more. He returned to his book, but Sarah noticed he wasn't turning the pages. Instead, his eyes kept drifting to the windows, and occasionally, he would mouth words silently to himself. She couldn't make out what he was saying, but the movement of his lips seemed repetitive, like a mantra or a prayer. During lunch recess, Sarah remained in her classroom to grade papers, but found herself drawn to the windows that seemed to fascinate Tommy so much. The playground was visible from this angle, and she could see children playing on the swings and climbing structures despite the light drizzle that continued to fall. But from her vantage point inside the building, she also realized something troubling. These same windows would provide a clear view into her classroom for anyone standing in the small grove of trees that bordered the school property. The trees were part of a small wooded area that separated Willowbrook Elementary from the residential neighborhood behind it. Sarah had always thought it was a pleasant feature that provided natural beauty and shade for the building. Now, looking at those shadows between the trunks, she wondered what else they might provide. When the children returned from lunch, Tommy was among the last to enter the classroom. As he passed by the windows, he paused and pressed his small hand against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. Sarah watched as he traced something in the condensation, letters that spelled out help before he quickly wiped them away with his sleeve. The gesture was so swift, so furtive, that Sarah might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for unusual behavior. But she had seen it, and the desperation in that single word, traced by a small finger on a fogged window, made her decision for her. That afternoon, as the children worked on their science journals, Sarah quietly pulled out her phone and composed a text message to her principal, "Mrs. Rodriguez, need to speak with you after school today about a student concern. Urgent but not emergency." She also began mentally composing another message, one she would send to her husband that evening. "Can you pick up a small security camera tomorrow? I'll explain later." As the school day wound toward its end, Sarah found herself paying attention to dismissal procedures in a way she never had before. She watched as parents and caregivers collected their children, noting which adults belonged with which students. Tommy's grandmother picked him up most days, a kind-faced woman in her 60s who always asked about his day and seemed genuinely caring in her interactions with him. But today, Sarah noticed something she had overlooked before. As Tommy walked toward the exit with his grandmother, he kept looking back toward the building, his expression fearful rather than relieved. And when they reached the edge of school property, near the wooded area that bordered the playground, Tommy grabbed his grandmother's hand and began walking faster, pulling her away from the trees. Sarah stayed at her window until Tommy and his grandmother disappeared around the corner, and even then, she found herself scanning the tree line for any sign of movement or unusual shadows. The rational part of her mind insisted that she might be overreacting, reading too much into the behavior of a child who might simply have an overactive imagination. But 22 years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts when it came to children, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that Tommy Henderson was afraid of something real, something immediate, and something that posed a genuine threat to his well-being. As she finally began packing up her teaching materials for the day, Sarah made a promise to herself and to Tommy. She would find out what was watching him, and she would make sure he was safe. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would protect this child who had somehow found the courage to ask for help in the only way he knew how. The rain continued to fall against the windows as Sarah turned off the lights and locked her classroom door, but she had the unsettling feeling that somewhere in the shadows of those trees, something was watching the school even now, waiting for another opportunity to remind a 7-year-old boy that he was being observed. The conversation with Principal Rodriguez that evening had been both validating and frustrating. Maria Rodriguez had been an educator for 30 years and principal at Willowbrook Elementary for the past 8. She listened to Sarah's concerns with the serious attention they deserved, taking notes as Sarah described Tommy's behavioral changes, his drawings, and his cryptic comments about being watched. "I've seen this before," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice heavy with experience. "Sometimes it's legitimate cause for concern, sometimes it's a child processing something they've seen on television or heard adults discussing. But we can't afford to assume it's innocent." They had agreed on a course of action. Sarah would document everything more systematically, Mrs. Rodriguez would review Tommy's school records and contact information, and they would both pay closer attention to pick-up and drop-off patterns. If the behavior continued or escalated, they would involve the school counselor and potentially contact Child Protective Services. "Trust your instincts, Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez had said as they concluded their meeting. "In 22 years, you've never brought me a concern that wasn't worth investigating." Now, 3 days later, Sarah sat in her car in the school parking lot at 6:30 a.m., a full hour before she normally arrived. The small security camera her husband had purchased was in her purse, along with the instruction manual she had studied the night before. The device was no bigger than a matchbox and could record for up to 12 hours on a single charge. More importantly, it could be controlled and monitored remotely through an app on her phone. The early morning air was crisp and clear, a sharp contrast to the rainy weather that had dominated the previous week. As Sarah walked across the empty parking lot toward the school building, she found herself studying the wooded area that bordered the playground with new eyes. In daylight, it looked innocent enough, mature oak and maple trees with a sparse understory of bushes and fallen leaves. But she could see how easily someone could position themselves among those trees and have a clear view into her classroom windows. Inside the building, Sarah's footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as she made her way to her classroom. The silence felt different when she was alone, more charged with possibility. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, immediately moving to the windows that had captured Tommy's anxious attention. From this side of the glass, looking out toward the trees, Sarah realized something that made her stomach clench with dread. Her classroom was on the ground floor, and the windows were large and positioned low enough that anyone standing among those trees would not only have a clear view into the room but would also be able to see details, where children sat, what they were doing, even what they were wearing. Sarah positioned the tiny camera carefully on top of a bookshelf that faced the windows, angling it so it would capture both the classroom and a partial view of the tree line outside. The device was small enough to be concealed behind a decorative plant, virtually invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Using the app on her phone, she tested the angle and recording quality, satisfied that it would document anything unusual that occurred during school hours. As other teachers began arriving and the building came to life around her, Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine. She arranged materials for the day's lessons, updated the calendar on her bulletin board, and prepared the morning writing prompt. But underneath the familiar tasks, her nerves hummed with anticipation and dread. Tommy arrived that morning at his usual time, walking beside his grandmother with the same hesitant gait Sarah had noticed before. But today, she observed something new. As they approached the school building, Tommy kept his eyes fixed on the ground until they were well past the wooded area. Only then did he look up, and when he did, his first glance was directly towards Sarah's classroom windows. "Good morning, Tommy," Sarah said as he entered the classroom, her voice carefully neutral despite the anxiety she felt. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell," he replied, but his response was automatic, distracted. He was already scanning the windows, and Sarah noticed that his small hands were clenched into fists at his sides. During the morning calendar time, while other children eagerly participated in counting the days of school and discussing the weather, Tommy remained uncharacteristically quiet. Sarah watched him through her peripheral vision as she led the lesson, noting that his attention was divided between the classroom activities and whatever he was looking for outside those windows. It was during independent reading time that Tommy's behavior escalated in a way that made Sarah's decision to install the camera feel prescient rather than paranoid. The children had settled into their reading spots around the classroom when Tommy suddenly stood up from his beanbag chair, his book falling forgotten to the floor. "He's there," Tommy whispered, but his voice carried across the quiet classroom. Several other children looked up from their books, following Tommy's gaze toward the windows. Sarah moved quickly but calmly toward Tommy, crouching beside him. "What do you see, sweetheart?" Tommy's finger trembled as he pointed toward the trees. "By the big oak tree. The one with the broken branch. He's wearing the dark coat again." Sarah looked where Tommy was pointing, studying the tree line carefully. The oak tree he mentioned was clearly visible, an ancient specimen with a distinctive broken branch that hung at an odd angle. But from her position inside the classroom, she couldn't see anyone standing near it. "Tommy, I want you to come sit by my desk for a few minutes, okay?" Sarah said softly. "Bring your book with you." As Tommy gathered his things with shaking hands, Sarah discreetly pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. She positioned herself where she could monitor the tree line while appearing to help Tommy with his reading. For the next 20 minutes, she watched those trees with the intensity of a detective, looking for any sign of movement or unusual shadows. She saw nothing. But Tommy's fear was real and immediate, in the way he positioned himself in the chair beside her desk, back to the wall, clear view of all exits, spoke to an anxiety that went far beyond imagination. During lunch, while the children were in the cafeteria, Sarah remained in her classroom and called her husband. "David, I need you to understand something," she said without preamble when he answered. "That camera we installed isn't just a precaution anymore. Something is really wrong here." She described Tommy's behavior that morning, the way he had pointed to a specific tree, the detail about the dark coat. David listened without interruption, and Sarah could hear the concern growing in his silence. "Have you talked to his family?" David asked finally. "That's the problem. He lives with his grandmother, and from everything I can see, she's wonderful with him. But Tommy acts like he's afraid to go home. Yesterday, I watched him try to delay leaving with her, asking if he could stay and help clean the classroom. What did the principal say about involving CPS? She wants more documentation first. And honestly, I understand that. We can't call in a report based on a child's fear of shadows. But David, this isn't about shadows. This child is terrified of something specific, and he's trying to tell us about it in the only way he knows how." That afternoon brought a development that shifted Sarah's understanding of the situation entirely. During art time, while the children worked on paper plate scarecrows, Tommy abandoned his project and began drawing on the back of his paper plate instead. Sarah noticed him working with unusual intensity, pressing his crayons so hard that he was nearly tearing through the paper. When she approached his table, Tommy quickly tried to flip the plate over, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of what he had drawn. It was another window scene, but this one was different from his previous drawings. This picture showed the classroom from the outside, as if drawn from the perspective of someone standing among the trees. The details were remarkable for a 7-year-old's artwork. He had included the correct number of windows, the position of Sarah's desk, even the bulletin board displays that would be visible from outside. But most disturbing was the figure he had drawn inside the classroom. It was clearly meant to be himself, sitting at his desk, but the expression on the drawn face was one of obvious fear. Around the edges of the drawing, Tommy had written words in his careful printing. "He knows where I sit. He knows my name. He told me secrets." "Tommy," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head, "can you tell me about your drawing?" Tommy's response was to grab the black crayon and begin scribbling over the entire image, pressing so hard that the crayon broke. "I'm not supposed to draw it," he whispered frantically. "He said not to tell anyone what he looks like." "Who said that, Tommy?" But the boy had shut down completely, his lips pressed together in a thin line, his eyes wide with what looked like terror. He spent the rest of art time methodically destroying his drawing until it was nothing but a black smudge on paper. After school, as Sarah watched Tommy leave with his grandmother, she noticed something that made her pull out her phone and discreetly take a photo. As they walked toward the edge of school property, an older man emerged from a car parked across the street. He was wearing a dark coat, navy blue or black, and he began walking parallel to Tommy and his grandmother, maintaining a distance but clearly following the same route. Sarah's instincts screamed that this was significant, but from her position inside the school, she couldn't see the man's face clearly enough to identify him. She watched until all three figures disappeared around the corner, then immediately called Mrs. Rodriguez. "I'm coming back to school," the principal said after Sarah described what she had witnessed. "Don't leave until I get there." While waiting for Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah reviewed the footage from her hidden camera on her phone. Most of it showed the normal activities of a second-grade classroom, but at approximately 10:15 a.m., right around the time Tommy had pointed toward the oak tree, there was something. The image quality wasn't perfect, but there was definitely a shadow among the trees that hadn't been there in earlier footage. It was human-shaped and appeared to be positioned exactly where Tommy had pointed. The shadow was visible for approximately 4 minutes before disappearing, moving in a way that suggested someone deliberately concealing themselves. When Mrs. Rodriguez arrived, she reviewed the footage with the intensity of someone who had seen too many situations like this before. "This changes things," she said grimly. "We're calling CPS tonight, and I'm also contacting the police. If someone is stalking this child, we need professional intervention immediately." As they prepared to lock up the building for the evening, Sarah found herself looking back at her classroom windows from the parking lot. In the fading daylight, she could see how exposed the room was, how vulnerable the children were to anyone who chose to watch them from the shadows of those trees. "Mrs. Mitchell," a small voice called from behind her. Sarah turned to see Tommy running toward her across the parking lot, his grandmother hurrying to catch up. "I forgot my homework folder," Tommy said, but his eyes were scanning the tree line even as he spoke. "Grandma said we could come back to get it." "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go get it." As they walked back toward the building, Tommy suddenly grabbed Sarah's hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to tell you something." "But not where he can see." Sarah's heart rate spiked. "What do you need to tell me, Tommy?" Tommy glanced around nervously, then leaned close to Sarah's ear. "He knows where I live. And he said if I tell anyone about our games, something bad will happen to Grandma." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Games. The euphemism that every teacher was trained to recognize, the word that transformed suspicion into certainty. "Tommy," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady, "no one is going to hurt your grandmother. And you're very brave for telling me. We're going to make sure you're safe." As they retrieved Tommy's homework folder from the classroom, Sarah caught Mrs. Rodriguez's eye and mouthed the word games. The principal's expression shifted immediately to one of grim understanding. That evening, as Sarah sat in her living room trying to process the day's revelations, she realized that the camera had captured more than just proof of someone watching the school. It had documented the beginning of a child's courage to speak the truth about something terrible happening to him. Tomorrow would bring phone calls to authorities, interviews with specialists, and the beginning of what would likely be a complex investigation. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself to feel the weight of responsibility that came with being the adult that Tommy had chosen to trust. Outside her own windows, David had installed motion sensor lights and drawn all the curtains closed. Because if someone was bold enough to stalk a child at an elementary school, there was no telling where their attention might turn next. Detective Lisa Chen had seen enough cases involving children to know that time was always a critical factor. When Principal Rodriguez called the police department that evening, Chen volunteered to take the case immediately, even though her shift had officially ended 2 hours earlier. She arrived at Willowbrook Elementary the next morning at 7 a.m., an hour before school started, to meet with Sarah and review the camera footage in detail. Chen was a compact woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a gentle demeanor that put children at ease. She had specialized in crimes against minors for the past 8 years, and her reputation for thorough, sensitive investigations had made her the go-to detective for the school district. "Show me everything," Chen said, settling into one of the small plastic chairs in Sarah's classroom. "And I mean everything. Sometimes the details that seem unimportant are the ones that break a case open." Sarah walked Detective Chen through Tommy's behavioral changes chronologically, starting with the first unusual drawings 3 weeks earlier. She showed Chen the various artwork Tommy had created, including photographs she had taken of his drawings before he destroyed them. The detective studied each image carefully, taking notes in a small leather notebook. "This level of detail," Chen said, pointing to Tommy's drawing of the classroom from an outside perspective, "this isn't typical of a child's imagination. He's drawing from observed reality." When they reviewed the camera footage, Chen requested that Sarah replay the segment from 10:15 a.m. multiple times. On the fourth viewing, she pointed to a section of the screen Sarah had missed. "There," Chen said. "Look at the base of that oak tree. See how the shadow moves? That's not wind-shifting branches. That's a person adjusting their position to get a better view." The footage showed the shadow figure maintaining position for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds before retreating deeper into the wooded area. Chen used her phone to take pictures of the clearest frames, already planning to have the department's technical team enhance the images. "I need to interview Tommy today," Chen said. "But I want to do it here, in familiar surroundings, with you present. Children are more likely to open up when they feel safe." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that professional help had arrived, apprehension about what Tommy might reveal when questioned by someone trained to elicit difficult truths from children. When Tommy arrived that morning, Sarah could see immediately that his anxiety had escalated overnight. His usual pale complexion was almost gray, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as he walked from his grandmother's car to the school entrance. During morning circle time, he positioned himself so close to Sarah's chair that he was practically sitting on her feet. "Tommy," Sarah said gently after the other children had transitioned to center time, "there's someone I'd like you to meet. Her name is Detective Chen, and she's here because she wants to help keep you safe." Tommy's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went completely white, and he began shaking his head rapidly. I can't talk to police," he said. "He said if police come, Grandma will get hurt." Detective Chen, who had been waiting in the hallway, entered the classroom with deliberate calm. She was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a soft sweater, rather than her usual professional attire, and she moved slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Hi Tommy," Chen said, settling cross-legged on the reading carpet. "Mrs. Mitchell told me you're really good at drawing. I love art. Would you mind showing me some of your pictures?" The approach was exactly right. Tommy's rigid posture relaxed slightly, though he remained pressed against Sarah's side. "I don't draw those pictures anymore," he whispered. "That's okay. Sometimes we don't want to draw certain things. Can you tell me why you stopped?" Tommy looked up at Sarah, then back at Detective Chen. "Because he said not to. He said drawing pictures was like telling secrets, and people who tell secrets get in trouble." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "You know what, Tommy? Sometimes grown-ups tell children things that aren't true. They do it because they want to keep secrets that they shouldn't be keeping. But the truth is, it's okay to tell secrets when those secrets are about someone doing something wrong." Over the next hour, with remarkable patience and skill, Detective Chen guided Tommy through a conversation that gradually revealed the scope of what had been happening to him. The man Tommy feared had been watching him for several weeks, initially from the trees outside school but also from other locations, near his grandmother's house, at the playground where Tommy sometimes played after school, even outside the grocery store where his grandmother shopped. "He knows everything about me," Tommy said, his voice barely audible. "He knows what time I go to school, what time I go home. He knows my favorite cereal and what color my bedroom is." "How does he know what color your bedroom is, Tommy?" Chen asked gently. Tommy's answer made both women's blood run cold. "Because he showed me pictures. Pictures of me sleeping." The interview had to be paused while Sarah stepped outside to compose herself. The implications of what Tommy had revealed were staggering. This wasn't just a case of someone watching a child from a distance. This was an organized pattern of stalking that had escalated to the point where the perpetrator was breaking into the family's home. When they resumed, Detective Chen used anatomically correct dolls and age-appropriate language to determine whether Tommy had been subjected to physical abuse. What emerged was a horrifying picture of psychological manipulation and grooming that had been building toward physical contact. He said we were going to play special games soon, Tommy revealed. Games that would be just between us. But first, he had to make sure I knew how to keep secrets. He said the games would be fun, but only if nobody else ever knew about them. Tommy described several instances where the man had approached him directly, once when his grandmother had sent him to check the mailbox alone, another time when he had briefly separated from her at the grocery store. During these encounters, the man had given Tommy small gifts, a toy car, some candy, a comic book, along with increasingly specific threats about what would happen if Tommy told anyone about their friendship. He said he was watching Grandma too, Tommy explained. He told me exactly what she was wearing yesterday, and what she had for breakfast. He said he could hurt her any time he wanted, but he wouldn't if I was a good boy and kept our secrets. Detective Chen's questioning revealed that the man had been systematically gathering information about Tommy's routine and his grandmother's schedule. He knew when she did laundry, when she went grocery shopping, when she watched her evening television programs. The level of surveillance was extensive and calculated. Tommy, this is very important, Chen said. Has this man ever asked you to go somewhere with him? Has he ever touched you in a way that made you uncomfortable? Tommy shook his head. Not yet. But he said soon we would go to a special place where we could play our games without anyone interrupting. He said it would be this weekend. The revelation that an abduction might be planned for the immediate future transformed the investigation from urgent to critical. Detective Chen immediately called for backup units to be stationed around the school and Tommy's neighborhood. She also arranged for an emergency protective order that would require Tommy and his grandmother to stay in a safe location until the perpetrator could be identified and apprehended. While Chen coordinated with other law enforcement agencies, Sarah helped Tommy pack his school belongings. The boy seemed simultaneously relieved and terrified, relieved that he had finally told the truth, terrified of the consequences he had been threatened with. Mrs. Mitchell, Tommy said as he placed his pencil box in his backpack, "Do you think Grandma will be mad at me for telling?" Sarah knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers. "Tommy, your grandmother loves you more than anything in the world. She's going to be proud of you for being so brave. And Detective Chen is going to make sure both of you are safe." When Tommy's grandmother arrived at the school, summoned by a carefully worded phone call from Principal Rodriguez, her reaction to the news was everything Sarah had hoped it would be. Eleanor Henderson, a retired nurse in her mid-60s, listened to Detective Chen's explanation with growing horror, but her primary concern was immediately for Tommy's well-being. "I knew something was wrong," Mrs. Henderson said, pulling Tommy into a fierce hug. "He's been having nightmares, waking up scared, but he wouldn't tell me why. I thought maybe it was something he'd seen on television." Detective Chen explained the safety protocols that would be implemented immediately. Mrs. Henderson and Tommy would be relocated to a safe house for the next several days while police worked to identify and apprehend the stalker. Plainclothes officers would monitor the school and Mrs. Henderson's residence. All of Tommy's normal activities would be suspended until the threat was neutralized. "Ma'am," Chen added, "we're going to need to search your home for evidence of how this person has been gathering information about your family. It's possible he's planted surveillance devices or has been entering the house when you're not there." The search of the Henderson residence that afternoon revealed the disturbing extent of the perpetrator's surveillance operation. Police found a small camera hidden in Tommy's bedroom, positioned to record his sleeping area. There were signs that someone had regularly entered the house through a basement window, fresh scratches on the window frame, soil tracks that didn't match the family's shoes, and evidence that personal items had been moved and replaced. Most chilling was the discovery of a notebook hidden beneath the back porch steps. The notebook contained detailed observations about Tommy's and his grandmother's daily routines, including time-stamped entries going back 6 weeks. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, and the level of detail was obsessive. Tuesday, September 15th, boy leaves house 7:45 a.m. Grandmother walks him to corner, returns alone. House empty 8 to 3:30. Boy afraid to go to bathroom alone at school, watched through classroom window 10:15 to 10:19. Grandmother grocery shopping Thursdays 2 to 4 p.m. The notebook also contained photographs, long-distance shots of Tommy at school, playing in his yard, walking with his grandmother. There were detailed floor plans of the Henderson house, indicating that the perpetrator had spent considerable time inside when the family was away. Detective Chen's team worked through the night processing the evidence and coordinating with federal authorities. The level of organization and planning suggested they were dealing with someone who had done this before, possibly to other children in other locations. By Thursday morning, they had developed a profile of their suspect and a plan to catch him. The notebook entries indicated that he was planning to approach Tommy on Saturday morning, when Mrs. Henderson typically went grocery shopping and left Tommy with a teenage neighbor for 2 hours. "We're going to use this information against him," Chen explained to Sarah during a briefing at the police station. "He doesn't know that Tommy has told us about him. As far as he knows, his plan is still on track." The plan was complex but straightforward. Tommy and his grandmother would remain in protective custody, but police would stage the house to appear normal. Undercover officers would be positioned throughout the neighborhood, and when the perpetrator made his move, they would be ready. "What about Tommy?" Sarah asked. "How is he handling all of this?" Detective Chen's expression softened. "Better than most children would. He's scared, but he's also relieved. He told me this morning that he feels like he can breathe again. That's how he put it, 'I can breathe again.'" Sarah spent Thursday afternoon preparing her classroom for Tommy's eventual return while trying to process everything that had been revealed. The camera she had installed was still recording, now as part of an official police investigation. The tree line outside her windows was under constant surveillance. But more than the external changes, Sarah found herself reflecting on the courage it had taken for Tommy to ask for help. His whispered "he watches me" had been a cry for protection delivered in the only way a 7-year-old could manage. His drawings, his positioning in the classroom, his reluctance to leave school, all of it had been communication, a child's desperate attempt to signal that he was in danger. As Sarah locked her classroom Thursday evening, she received a text from Detective Chen, "Operation tomorrow morning. We'll update you as soon as it's over. Tommy asked me to tell you he misses school and wants to come back soon." Sarah smiled for the first time in days. Tommy would come back to school, and when he did, he would return as a survivor rather than a victim. The camera would be removed, the shadows outside the windows would lose their menace, and a 7-year-old boy would be able to concentrate on learning to read instead of watching for danger. But first, they had to catch the monster who had stolen a child's sense of safety and tried to turn innocence into something dark and twisted. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of October day that painted the world in sharp relief and made every shadow seem more defined. Detective Chen had been awake since 4 a.m., coordinating final details with the multi-agency task force that had assembled to apprehend Tommy's stalker. By 6 a.m., more than 20 law enforcement officers were positioned throughout the Henderson neighborhood, invisible to casual observation but ready to respond within seconds. Sarah wasn't supposed to be there, but she had convinced Chen to let her monitor the operation from an unmarked van parked 3 blocks away. Her investment in Tommy's safety went beyond professional duty now. It had become personal in the way that only happens when a teacher realizes she may be the only barrier between a child and genuine harm. The surveillance van was cramped and filled with electronic equipment that hummed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah sat beside Detective Chen, watching multiple video feeds from cameras positioned around the Henderson property. The technology was sophisticated beyond anything she had imagined: thermal imaging, motion sensors, and audio equipment that could pick up conversations from hundreds of yards away. "We've been tracking similar patterns in 3 other states," Chen explained quietly as they waited. "This individual has been operating for at least 2 years, possibly longer. What happened with Tommy isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a calculated system." The weight of that revelation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. Tommy hadn't been randomly selected. He had been specifically targeted by someone who had perfected the art of identifying and stalking vulnerable children. The notebook found at the Henderson house had revealed meticulous planning that went back weeks before the first signs of unusual behavior that Sarah had noticed. "How many other children?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "We're still investigating, but based on evidence we've recovered, at least 6 children in 4 different states. Tommy was going to be the 7th. Chen's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the anger underneath. "What makes this case different is that someone noticed the warning signs and acted on them. In the other cases, the children disappeared before anyone realized they were being watched." At 7:30 a.m., Mrs. Henderson's car pulled out of the driveway right on schedule, following the routine she had maintained every Saturday for months. From their position in the surveillance van, Sarah watched Tommy's grandmother drive away, completely unaware that her departure was being monitored by both law enforcement and the predator who had been studying her family's patterns for weeks. The house looked exactly as it should, curtains drawn in their usual configuration, Saturday morning newspaper still lying on the front steps, no visible signs of the extensive police presence that surrounded the property. Detective Martinez was positioned inside the house, dressed in civilian clothes and ready to pose as a babysitter if the suspect made contact before attempting an abduction. "Subject vehicle approaching from the north," came the crackling voice through Chen's radio at 8:47 a.m. "Dark blue sedan, license plate matches the partial we recovered from school surveillance." Through the van's tinted windows, Sarah could see the Henderson house 3 blocks away. The neighborhood was quiet, with only occasional early morning joggers and dog walkers moving along the sidewalks. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, unremarkable, exactly the kind of suburban setting where parents felt safe letting their children play outside. The blue sedan drove slowly past the house twice before parking 2 streets over, exactly as the notebook entries had predicted the perpetrator would do. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched the car through the surveillance cameras. After 18 minutes that felt like hours, the driver's door opened. The man who emerged looked devastatingly ordinary. Medium height, brown hair beginning to thin at the crown, wearing jeans and the dark navy coat Tommy had described in his drawings. He could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's coworker, anyone's relative. There was nothing in his appearance that screamed danger, no obvious signs of the monster that lurked beneath his unremarkable exterior. Visual confirmation on the suspect, Chen spoke into her radio. "He's moving toward the wooded area behind the target residence." Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the man moved with practiced stealth through the trees behind the Henderson property. His movements were deliberate and confident, clearly indicating that he had taken this route many times before. He carried a small backpack and what appeared to be a gift bag, props, Sarah realized with revulsion, intended to lure Tommy into compliance. The man paused at the edge of the tree line, scanning the neighborhood for any signs of activity or surveillance. Sarah felt her heart racing as he looked directly toward their position, but the van was too far away and too well concealed for him to notice anything unusual. After several minutes of careful observation, he moved toward the house. "All units, suspect is approaching the rear entrance." Chen's voice was calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the tension underneath. "Remember, we need him inside the house before we move. We want him on attempted kidnapping charges, not just trespassing." Through the sophisticated surveillance equipment, the task force watched as the man used a key to enter through the basement door, a key he had apparently made during one of his previous illegal entries into the Henderson home. The realization that this stranger had been inside Tommy's house, possibly while the family slept, made Sarah feel physically sick. "He's in the basement," came Detective Martinez's voice through the radio. "Moving toward the main floor. I can hear his footsteps on the stairs." The man moved through the house with disturbing confidence, heading directly toward what he believed was Tommy's location. His familiarity with the layout was obvious. He knew exactly where he was going, which rooms to avoid, how to move quietly through the house without triggering the normal creaks and sounds that might alert a child to his presence. Instead of finding a vulnerable 7-year-old alone and afraid, he found Detective Martinez waiting in the living room. "Police. Don't move. Put your hands where I can see them." The arrest was swift and decisive. Within 30 seconds, the man was on the ground in handcuffs, his backpack and gift bag secured as evidence. Additional officers flooded the house from multiple entry points, ensuring that the suspect had no opportunity to resist or escape. Subject in custody, Chen's voice crackled through the radio. House is secure. Begin evidence collection. Sarah felt a wave of relief so powerful that she had to sit down in the cramped van. It was over. Tommy was safe. The nightmare that had consumed her thoughts for weeks had finally ended. But as Detective Chen coordinated with the arrest team, it became clear that this was just the beginning of a much larger investigation. The man's real name was Robert Caldwell, and his arrest unraveled a disturbing pattern that extended far beyond Tommy's case. Caldwell was a registered sex offender from 3 states away, someone who had been missing from mandatory check-ins with his parole officer for over 2 months. His car contained additional surveillance equipment, children's clothing in various sizes, and a detailed map marking the locations of 6 elementary schools in the area. Most significantly, police found a laptop computer containing hundreds of photographs of children, not just Tommy, but dozens of other children from multiple schools and neighborhoods. The images showed children at playgrounds, walking to school, playing in their yards, all taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. "We're calling in the FBI," Chen told Sarah as they drove back to the police station. "This is bigger than anything we initially suspected. Caldwell appears to have been operating a systematic campaign of child stalking across multiple states." The FBI's Crimes Against Children unit arrived within hours, bringing additional resources and expertise to what had expanded from a single stalking case into a multi-state investigation of child exploitation. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a specialist in predatory behavior, took charge of the expanded investigation. "Mr. Caldwell has been very busy," Agent Torres explained during a briefing that evening. "We've identified evidence linking him to suspicious activities in at least 4 other states over the past 18 months. What happened with Tommy appears to be part of a much larger pattern." The evidence recovered from Caldwell's car and laptop suggested that he had been operating what amounted to a mobile child stalking operation. He would move to a new city, spend several weeks identifying potential victims, gather extensive intelligence about their routines and families, and then attempt abductions when he felt confident he could succeed without being detected. "The level of planning is extraordinary," Agent Torres continued. He had detailed files on dozens of children, including photographs, daily schedules, family information, even floor plans of their homes. This wasn't opportunistic predation, it was systematic hunting. For Sarah, learning about the scope of Caldwell's activities was both horrifying and validating. Her instincts about Tommy's situation had been correct, but the danger had been even greater than she had imagined. If she hadn't trusted her concerns enough to install the camera, if Tommy hadn't found the courage to communicate his fear, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Detective Chen called Sarah with updates throughout the weekend as the scope of Caldwell's crimes became clear. The laptop analysis revealed that he had successfully abducted at least 3 other children over the past 18 months, all boys between the ages of 6 and 8, all from families where the children spent time with elderly grandparents or other caregivers who might be less vigilant about unusual approaches from strangers. Tommy wasn't his first victim, Chen explained during a phone call Sunday evening. But thanks to Tommy's courage and your instincts, he's going to be Caldwell's last. The FBI was working to identify Caldwell's previous victims and determine their current status, while coordinating with law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions where he had been active. The investigation had become a priority case, with resources being allocated from across the federal system. Tommy and his grandmother returned to their home on Sunday afternoon, accompanied by a security consultant who installed new locks, an alarm system, and motion sensor lighting around the property. But more importantly, they returned with the knowledge that the threat was over and that the system had worked to protect them. "I can't believe how close we came," Mrs. Henderson told Sarah during a phone call that evening. "If you hadn't noticed the changes in Tommy's behavior, if you hadn't taken his fears seriously. I don't want to think about what might have happened." The conversation was emotional for both women. Mrs. Henderson had been caring for Tommy since his parents' death in a car accident 3 years earlier, and the thought that she had unknowingly exposed him to such danger was devastating. But Sarah helped her understand that there was no way she could have known about Caldwell's surveillance. His methods were too sophisticated and his approach too calculated for a normal person to detect. "You gave Tommy a safe, loving home," Sarah assured her. "And when he needed help, he felt secure enough to ask for it. That's what saved him, knowing that the adults in his life would protect him when he told them about his fears." On Monday morning, Tommy walked into Sarah's classroom with a transformation that was immediately apparent. The hypervigilant tension that had characterized his behavior for weeks was completely gone. He moved with the natural ease of a child who felt safe in his environment, making eye contact, smiling, participating in conversations with his classmates. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," he said cheerfully as he hung up his backpack. "I finished all my homework this weekend. Even the extra reading." During morning circle time, Tommy participated with an enthusiasm Sarah hadn't seen since early September. He shared during show and tell, volunteered to be the calendar helper, and settled into independent reading with genuine focus rather than the constant vigilance that had marked his behavior during the weeks of stalking. Principal Rodriguez visited the classroom that morning to check on Tommy's readiness to return to his normal routine. She found him enthusiastically working on a math worksheet, completely absorbed in solving addition problems. "How are you feeling today, Tommy?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked gently. Tommy looked up from his work with clear, untroubled eyes. "I feel really good," he said with a smile. "I feel like I can think about school stuff again instead of worrying about other things." It was during art time that Tommy created what would become Sarah's most treasured piece of student artwork. Instead of the dark, fearful images that had characterized his recent drawings, Tommy created a bright, colorful picture of the classroom filled with smiling children and cheerful decorations. In the center of the drawing, he had carefully printed in his best handwriting, "I am safe at school. Mrs. Mitchell helps me learn new things every day." But perhaps most significantly, Tommy had drawn the classroom windows as sources of light and beauty rather than threat. Instead of shadowy figures lurking outside, his windows showed blue sky, white clouds, and a bright yellow sun that filled the classroom with warmth and possibility. "This is beautiful, Tommy," Sarah said, admiring the artwork. "Tell me about your picture." "It's our classroom, but the way it really is," Tommy explained seriously. "Before, I was seeing scary things that weren't really there. Now I can see the good things again." The investigation continued for several more weeks as federal authorities built their comprehensive case against Caldwell. Sarah provided detailed testimony to a grand jury about Tommy's behavioral changes, her decision to install surveillance equipment, and the timeline of events leading to Caldwell's arrest. The camera footage from her classroom became crucial evidence in establishing the pattern of Caldwell's stalking behavior and proving that his surveillance of Tommy had been systematic and prolonged. The technical analysis of the video revealed details that had been invisible to the naked eye, including timestamps that correlated perfectly with entries in Caldwell's notebook. Agent Torres kept Sarah informed about the broader implications of the case as the investigation expanded. 3 other children in different states were identified as Caldwell's victims, and all were safely recovered and receiving appropriate support services. The families had been living with the devastating uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their children, and Caldwell's arrest finally provided them with answers and closure. "Your willingness to trust your instincts and act on them saved more than just Tommy," Agent Torres told Sarah during a follow-up interview. "Every piece of evidence we recovered from Caldwell's activities helps us understand his methods and potentially identify other victims we haven't found yet." The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the FBI completed their evidence analysis. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and testimony from multiple victims, Caldwell ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple charges of child exploitation, kidnapping, and interstate transportation of minors for illegal purposes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Sarah, the most meaningful outcome was watching Tommy rediscover his joy in learning and his confidence in the safety of his environment. Within 2 weeks of Caldwell's arrest, Tommy was not only back to his old academic performance but was actually exceeding his previous achievements. It's like he can finally use all his mental energy for learning instead of watching for danger, Sarah explained to her husband one evening. His reading level has jumped significantly, and he's asking questions about everything. It's wonderful to see. The camera was removed from Sarah's classroom, but the experience had changed her approach to teaching in fundamental ways. She found herself more attuned than ever to the subtle signs that might indicate a child in distress, and she began sharing Tommy's story, with appropriate confidentiality protections, during professional development sessions. Trust your instincts, she would tell other educators. If something feels wrong, investigate. If a child seems afraid, listen. Children depend on us to be their advocates, and sometimes we're the only adults in their lives who are in a position to recognize when they need help. Tommy's grandmother sent Sarah a handwritten thank you card that she would treasure for the rest of her career. Thank you for seeing what others might have missed, and for caring enough to act on your concerns. Tommy talks about you every day, and he knows that you kept him safe when he needed it most. We will never forget what you did for our family. As the school year progressed, Tommy continued to thrive both academically and socially. The trauma of his experience didn't disappear entirely. He occasionally had nightmares and remained somewhat more cautious around strangers than other children his age, but with the support of a child psychologist and the loving care of his grandmother, he developed healthy coping strategies and a strong sense of personal resilience. On Halloween, Tommy came to school dressed as a police detective, complete with a badge, notebook, and magnifying glass. When Sarah asked about his costume choice, he grinned and said, "Detective Chen says that people who help catch bad guys are heroes. I want to be a hero too, so I can help other kids who are scared." During the class Halloween party, as Sarah watched Tommy laugh and play with his classmates without any shadow of fear or anxiety, she reflected on the profound responsibility that teachers carry beyond academic instruction. Sometimes, she realized, the most important lesson a teacher provides has nothing to do with reading or mathematics or science. Sometimes, the most important lesson is helping a child understand that they have the right to feel safe, the courage to ask for help, and the confidence to trust that the adults in their lives will protect them when protection is needed. The windows in Sarah's classroom continued to let in light and learning for many more years, but they never again harbored shadows that threatened a child's sense of safety. And in the end, that transformation from fear to safety, from helplessness to hope, became the most important victory of Sarah's teaching career. We've reached the end of this intense story about courage, instinct, and protection. What did you think of teacher Sarah and little Tommy's journey? Which moment impacted you the most, discovering the haunting drawings, the tension of the investigation, or the final operation to catch the predator? Leave your comment below sharing your thoughts about this narrative. If you enjoyed this suspense story, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps me continue creating quality content. And if you want more engaging stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new uploads. Your opinion matters a lot to me. What kind of story would you like to see in the next video? Suspense, drama, mystery, or maybe something completely different? Let's chat in the comments.